Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a former federal prosecutor builds his dream home on the wrong side of a powerful HOA, a quiet land dispute turns into a chilling war of intimidation, forged justice, and revenge. But they picked the wrong man, and he's been waiting for them to slip. I bought the land 7 years ago because it was quiet, inconvenient, and legally clean. Those three qualities rarely coexist in coastal South Carolina, especially anywhere near a gated community with palm trees in the name. My parcel sat just outside the formal boundary of Palmetto Estates, a clean slice of property that touched their fence line but never crossed into their covenants, bylaws, or petty authoritarian fantasies. I confirmed that fact 6 separate times before closing. I read every easement, every plat, every recorded whisper of obligation. Old habits die hard after 18 years as a federal prosecutor. The house I built annoyed them before it was even finished. Flat roof, modern lines, solar panels angled toward the marsh instead of God, beige concrete instead of colonial brick. It didn't match their aesthetic, and more importantly, it didn't bow to it. The first time I met Cheryl Baxter, she introduced herself on my driveway while my contractor was still unloading materials. She didn't say hello. She said, "You know, that design is going to affect surrounding property values." She smiled when she said it, the kind of smile that assumes compliance before resistance has even formed. I told her calmly that my land was not part of Palmetto Estates, that I had permits, and that the county had approved everything. She nodded as if I were a child explaining how crayons worked. Then she asked who my builder was, whether I planned to install a fence, and if I would be open to community standards. That last phrase hung in the air like a legal threat disguised as a suggestion. When I repeated that I wasn't in her community, she laughed once, sharp and dismissive, and said, "Everyone around here is part of something." You'll see. Over the next year, she made sure I did. She showed up uninvited twice more while construction was ongoing, once with a clipboard, once with a man she introduced as our security liaison. She photographed my driveway, asked workers whether I had permits for the panels, and told my electrician that the HOA did not allow that kind of installation. When he pointed out that the HOA had no jurisdiction, she told him, "We'll see what the county thinks." 2 days later, a county inspector showed up. Polite, thorough, found nothing. That became the pattern. Noise complaints when I wasn't home. Anonymous reports of unpermitted work after everything was finished. Letters from Palmetto Estates Legal Committee warning me about violations of bylaws I had never agreed to. I responded to none of them. Silence is a language power understands, and I wanted them to keep talking. The first offer came 2 years after I moved in. Cheryl knocked on my door with a folder and a rehearsed smile. She talked about community growth, about how my land was strategically positioned, about a developer interested in expanding the neighborhood. She named a number that was generous but not honest. I declined. She tried again 6 months later with a higher figure and less charm. I declined again. The third time, she stopped pretending it was friendly. She leaned forward across my kitchen table and said, "Mr. Green, this development is happening, with you or without you." I asked her if that was a threat. She replied, "It's just how things work in this county. The Baxters have been here a long time." After that, the pressure became less subtle and more frequent. Patrol cars started showing up late at night responding to calls about suspicious activity. Once, an officer asked me if I was storing weapons. Another time, they claimed a neighbor reported shouting. I live alone. I don't shout. Every visit ended the same way. A brief apology, a note in their system, nothing to pursue. But the visits kept coming. 14 times in 2 years. Always different officers. Always the same tone of mild disappointment that they hadn't caught me doing something worth writing up. Rumors followed. A woman at the grocery store asked if I used to work for the government and got forced out. Someone else mentioned hearing I was under investigation. None of it surprised me. Smear campaigns are cheaper than lawsuits and safer than violence. Cheryl understood that. She also understood time. Every month I stayed meant another delay for her expansion plans. Every delay cost money. So I documented everything: dates, names, badge numbers, letters, voicemails, camera footage. I didn't confront her. I didn't escalate. I waited, because people like Cheryl Baxter don't stop when you resist. They stop when they make a mistake so big it swallows them whole. And the more confident they are, the bigger that mistake tends to be. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. I was in the middle of regrading a client's easement dispute file when I heard the tires. Not one vehicle, three. A black SUV with the Palmetto Estates logo plastered on the side, a county sheriff's cruiser, and a battered white Ford pickup with equipment racks and men in neon vests. I closed my laptop without a word and stood. It wasn't unexpected. It was just sooner than I thought. I stepped outside onto my porch with a mug of coffee I no longer intended to drink. The first to step out was Cheryl, dressed like she was headed to a church fundraiser, blazer, folder, fake pearls. She was flanked by two men. One I didn't recognize, clearly a contractor, and the other, of course, was her brother, Sergeant Roy Baxter, in full uniform with mirrored sunglasses and a smirk that stretched too wide for the situation. "Mr. Green," Cheryl called out sweetly, walking up the gravel like she owned the land under her heels. "We have an official notice for you today." She held out a manila folder. Inside, a document titled Emergency Demolition Order, Unsafe Structure, County Seal, typed case number, signature at the bottom, Judge Harold Mitchell. I looked at the document, then looked up at her. I didn't receive a hearing notice. No inspector ever entered this property. I'd like to know on what basis this was issued. Cheryl flipped open her own copy and handed me a second sheet. Inspection was conducted last week. Here's the report. Electrical hazard, foundation instability, non-compliant solar array. Your home poses a risk to adjacent properties, Mr. Green. I read the inspector's name and nearly laughed. Jeremy Talcott. I knew the man. He'd retired 3 years ago and moved to Arizona. You're claiming Jeremy Talcott inspected my house last week. Roy stepped forward, one hand resting casually near his belt. Mr. Green, we don't have time for debate. The order's signed. You can leave peacefully or I'll arrest you for obstruction and interference with a lawful execution of a court order. I folded the papers slowly, deliberately, and tucked them into the inside pocket of my jacket. I'll stay right here. Roy's smile turned sharper. Then I'm placing you under arrest. Turn around, hands behind your back. I didn't resist. I turned, felt the cold click of steel around my wrists, and watched the contractor behind them give a subtle nod to his crew. They started unloading demolition prep tools, bolt cutters, stakes, measuring gear. Not for the house, not yet. That would be too loud, too public, but they'd start chipping away at the periphery just enough to mark the ground, just enough to intimidate. As Roy read off a rote Miranda warning, I glanced down at my wrist. My Apple Watch blinked red. Recording. My house cameras had been running since I saw them turn the corner. The doorbell cam had audio. Even the Wi-Fi trail from their phones, if they connected to the wrong network, would log presence. Every word they said, every move they made, it was all being captured, but not just to the cloud. I had created backups, 2 encrypted SSDs and a flash drive with full recording cycles. That flash drive now sat inside a locked metal box at the Charleston Credit Union, 3 towns away, inside a safety deposit box registered under the name of a trust I'd set up years ago. Roy walked me to his cruiser like it was a parade. Cheryl looked delighted. I said nothing, because if I resisted now, they'd retreat, regroup, and come back later with cleaner paperwork and fewer mistakes. But if I let them walk right into their own trap, forge documents, destroy property, arrest a man on his own land using a fake court order, then they would fall all the way down. No appeals, no denials, no settlements. Let them bury themselves. I'd bring the shovel. The ride to the station was quiet, which suited me fine. Roy didn't even bother with the radio, just drove with that self-satisfied smugness he wore like a badge of honor, knuckles loose on the wheel, humming something that sounded like a country song played off-key. He didn't say a word until we pulled into the back lot of the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office and parked near the intake doors. "You brought this on yourself," he muttered as he killed the engine. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Inside, the officers at the desk gave Roy a nod that felt just a little too casual. No one asked him to show paperwork. No one questioned the arrest. It was a closed system, a family business in uniform. Roy handed over a single page with the supposed demolition order and rattled off the charges like they were items on a fast food menu. Obstruction of justice, interfering with a court-ordered action, refusing a lawful directive from a peace officer, possibly resisting, but he cooperated at the scene, so I'll leave that off. No mention of the lack of warrant. No mention of a real court proceeding. No mention of the fact that I was standing on my own legally distinct land with no obligation to obey a homeowners association I'd never joined. That would have complicated things, and complicating things wasn't in their plan. I asked for my phone call the moment the cuffs came off. The deputy behind the desk, a younger guy with a Marine-style haircut and the kind of eyes that avoided contact, looked at Roy, not me. Roy shook his head. Not yet. Processing first. Then maybe. I could have pressed. Legally, I should have pressed. But I didn't. I nodded once and let them fingerprint me, take my mugshot, and escort me to a small concrete holding cell with a metal bench and an air vent that whined like a dying mosquito. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and closed my eyes. This was the window they didn't understand, the precise 6-hour gap that could make or break their scheme. In South Carolina, detaining someone without granting access to a phone call or legal counsel beyond a reasonable period, especially for a non-violent charge, is a violation of both state and federal civil rights. That reasonable period typically clocks in at 2 hours. 6? That's just enough to call it malicious. And while I sat there, listening to the buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional clank of boots down the hall, I knew they were already at it back home. The contractor crew wouldn't waste time. They didn't have legal authority to tear the structure down, not really, but I guessed they'd start with symbolic gestures, break something visible, make noise, mark territory. The psychological playbook: destabilize, humiliate, dominate. I'd seen it before. In courtrooms, in interrogations, and sometimes on the streets. What they didn't know was that my system at home was custom built. Not just Nest cams and Ring doorbells, but full spectrum security, motion-triggered 4K cameras, continuous interior feed routed through a private server, and a mirrored backup that uploaded off-site every 60 minutes. My network had been secured with enterprise-grade encryption and a firewall that would make most IT professionals blink. But still, I didn't rely on that alone. 2 days before this happened, I had taken every single critical recording, prior harassment footage, audio clips, letters, logs of police visits, and copied them to a tamper-proof flash drive. I made a second copy on an SSD. Then I drove out to Charleston, opened a trust-owned safety deposit box, and locked it all away. Cheryl might have eyes in the sheriff's office. She might even have someone in the county clerk's department. But she sure as hell didn't have the combination to that vault. And even if she burned my house to the ground, that flash drive would still exist. Hours dragged by. The room smelled faintly of bleach and sweat. I paced exactly once every 20 minutes just to keep my blood moving. No one came, no lawyer, no phone, nothing. At one point, I heard Roy's voice through the door, muffled but audible. Yeah, he's not going anywhere. Let him stew. Meanwhile, make sure the crew knows. Fence down, mailbox gone, hit those panels if they can without drawing heat. That last part caught me off guard. The solar panels. They were expensive, sure, but more importantly, they were mounted under specific zoning approvals that I'd fought tooth and nail for with the county. Damaging them wasn't just vandalism, it was grounds for a civil claim and potentially a federal energy violation depending on what was hit. If they went for those, they were dumber than I thought. Or more desperate. I sat back down and stared at the steel bars in front of me. The cell door had a tiny rectangular window, no glass, just mesh and metal. At exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes, a different deputy opened the door and stuck his head in. "You need anything?" "Phone call," I said calmly. "Can't do it yet. Sergeant Baxter said we're holding off until processing clears upstairs." "Processing cleared the minute you booked me. You're violating policy." He didn't respond. Just shut the door again like I'd asked him for a steak dinner. I heard the click of the lock and nothing else. The truth was, I could have started shouting. I could have demanded counsel, quoted statutes, filed a complaint. But that would have triggered a paper trail. And what I needed now was exactly this. A record of no paper trail. I needed them to bury themselves in violations. I needed them overconfident. Because when I finally made that call, it wouldn't go to a lawyer or a bail bondsman. It would go straight to a woman in Charleston who still had her federal credentials and access to systems Roy and Cheryl couldn't even spell. So I waited, and they kept digging their own grave. 6 hours and 8 minutes after the metal door clanked shut behind me, it finally swung open again. This time, the deputy didn't knock. He just stood there, looking somewhere past my shoulder like I was a filing cabinet that had finally been requested. "You get your call." No apology, no explanation, just a flick of his chin toward the end of the hallway. They took me to a side room, empty except for a table with a wired landline, a bolted chair, and a camera in the corner, probably not even working. Roy didn't bother to escort me this time. He was busy somewhere else, probably gloating. I picked up the handset, punched in the number from memory, and listened to the soft click of the line connecting. "Carter," said a familiar voice, tired, clipped, focused. "It's me," I said. There was a beat of silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "Jesus, Marshal, what the hell happened?" "I was arrested this morning at my home by Roy Baxter, acting on a forged demolition order signed, allegedly, by Judge Harold Mitchell. No prior notice, no hearing, no inspection. They brought a demolition crew and police escort. I refused to leave the property. Roy cuffed me. I've been held for over 6 hours without access to counsel or communication. My house is being tampered with as we speak." More silence. "You're saying they forged a court order?" she said finally, voice now low and cold, "and actually executed it." "I'm saying I let them." That stopped her. I knew they were going to do something. I saw it coming. I needed them to go all the way, to make it federal, to make it irreversible. "You're insane," she muttered. "You could have just—" "No. If I had pushed back, they'd have backed off. They'd try again later with lawyers, legit inspectors, maybe even convince a judge next time. I needed them confident, reckless. Now they've made their move, and I've got them all on tape." I paused, then added, "There's a backup drive locked in a safety deposit box, Charleston Credit Union, under the Castor Royce Trust. You'll find recordings from this morning, footage of the arrest, their statements, timestamps, even the document scans. I left detailed instructions in the envelope. I could hear her rustling papers on her desk, flipping through a Rolodex or a file folder. Then, I have the trust file. You left it with me last year, just in case." "Jesus Christ, Marshal. You planned this?" "Not all of it," I admitted. "Just enough to catch them with their pants down." "You want me to confirm the order's fake?" "I want you to verify it through official channels. Run the docket number. Contact Judge Mitchell's clerk. Check the inspector's license. I guarantee it's invalid. And when it is, I want you to call the Bureau." "The Bureau?" Her voice rose slightly. "You want me to escalate this to a federal corruption case based on what, your security footage and a gut feeling?" "No. I want you to escalate it based on unlawful detention, forged judicial documents, abuse of power by law enforcement, and a pattern of coordinated civil rights violations going back at least 3 years. I've got 4 prior incidents logged with their names on them. This morning was just the final straw. Denise Carter wasn't just any federal contact. She was the one I trained back when she interned with the Justice Department. Now she held a badge and a federal mandate. And unlike Roy, she actually knew how to use both without shooting herself in the foot." "You said your property's under active tampering?" she asked. "Yes, they've started breaking things on the perimeter. Panels, mailbox, fence. I saw them begin before Roy cuffed me. Crew had no credentials, no permit posted, no law enforcement observer present except Roy." "All right," she said, her tone shifting from shocked to surgical. "I'll need about 2 hours. You'll hear from me when I know more." The line went dead before I could respond. They led me back to the cell without a word. I sat down and folded my arms. Time moved differently now. Charged, suspended, electric. I knew Denise. 2 hours was enough for her to burn half the county's back office records if she had to. All I had to do now was wait for her to light the match. I didn't hear from Denise after 2 hours. I heard from her after 1 hour and 16 minutes. The deputy opened my cell door again, this time with a much tighter posture, no casual shrug, no bored expression. He looked like someone had just handed him a live grenade with the pin halfway out. "You've been cleared for release," he said. "No, sir. No, apologies for the misunderstanding." Just that stiff phrase, like it hurt him to say it. I stood slowly, adjusted my sleeves, and followed him past the booking desk without speaking. Roy was nowhere in sight. A man in a dark blue suit stood just outside the door, arms crossed, clean cut in that unmistakable federal way. His ID badge clipped to his lapel read, U.S. Marshal Service. He glanced at me, then nodded toward the car idling at the curb. "Let's go," he said. He didn't say my name. Didn't have to. I got in the back seat, and we pulled away from the sheriff's station with a silence that spoke louder than sirens. 10 minutes later, we turned down my road. There were already 4 black SUVs parked by my gate. The scene looked like a crime scene, because by now it was. Yellow tape stretched across the edge of my driveway, but not by the county. This was federal. The contractor crew that had been chipping away at my property were corralled near the back of their truck, surrounded by agents in navy jackets. One of the men looked like he was explaining something with too many hand gestures. Another was already sitting on the tailgate with his head in his hands. I saw it instantly. The mailbox was gone, torn from its base. The steel post bent sideways and lying in the grass like a casualty. My fence gate had been pulled down, panel cracked in half, screws scattered in the dirt, and the solar panels, God help them, they had gone after those too. One lay shattered at an angle, still half attached, wires exposed and flayed like nerves. Another was completely gone, ripped clean off and dumped near a pile of broken lumber. I didn't need to speak. The marshal just gestured toward a woman walking toward us from the edge of the porch. Denise Carter. Business skirt, blazer, hair tied back. She had her phone in one hand and a printed document folder in the other. Her face was tight. "Don't say a word yet," she said as she reached me. "Just listen." She held out the folder. Inside were 2 sheets. The first, a copy of the emergency demolition order signed by Judge Harold Mitchell. The second, a signed affidavit from the actual Judge Harold Mitchell, time-stamped less than an hour ago, swearing under penalty of perjury that he never saw, signed, nor authorized any such order, that his name had been forged, that the docket number used belonged to an unrelated tenant dispute filed 2 years ago. Next, Denise pulled out a third sheet, a verification from the County Records Department. The inspection report from Jeremy Talcott did not exist in any official archive. The inspector's name had been retired from their list since 2021. The license number listed belonged to a pest control company in Savannah. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the wind. "This isn't just a bad forgery," she said, voice low. "It's a coordinated fabrication. At least 3 parties involved, possibly more. Forged documents, false representation, destruction of property under color of law, and you, illegally detained under a non-existent order, held without communication for over 6 hours." She glanced over at one of the federal techs who gave her a thumbs up. "Your security footage is intact. The server was tampered with, but not successfully. And the encrypted files you deposited," she patted her bag. "We've got them." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "They tried to wipe the cloud upload," she continued. "Logged into your account from a spoofed IP about 2 hours ago. Tried to delete the last 3 days' footage. Didn't know you had dual encryption and offline sync backups." "I assumed someone would try," I said. She actually smiled. "Barely. Good assumption." The agents had already begun collecting evidence, photographing the broken panels, the damage to the fence, the site of the torn-out mailbox. One of them held up a tablet showing the internal footage from the moment Roy Baxter slapped cuffs on me, including the moment I said, "This is my land," and he said, "You're obstructing a court order." That phrase alone would be enough to crucify him. "Where's Roy?" I asked. "He's still at the station, acting like this is all a big misunderstanding." "And Cheryl?" "She's not answering her phone, but we've got a subpoena out for her personal devices and HOA files. One of the workers already flipped, says she paid him $2,000 cash for a demo job that wouldn't draw heat." His words. The pieces were falling. Denise handed me a temporary release form and motioned to one of the SUVs. "I need you to come with us for a formal statement. After that, we'll see about pressing charges." I looked back at my house. Violated, cracked, dented, but still standing. "Give me 5 minutes," I said. I walked slowly to the edge of the porch, leaned on the rail, and took it all in. The broken fence, the busted panel, the mess they made thinking they'd walk away clean. Then I turned back, walked toward the SUV, and climbed inside. The reckoning had just begun. I was in the back seat of a federal SUV headed toward Charleston when Denise finally broke the silence. "They've been doing this for years," she said without looking at me. "That's what I'm starting to see." "You weren't the first." I didn't respond immediately. The adrenaline had worn off somewhere around mile marker 29, replaced by the slow, heavy pulse of focused rage, the kind that sits low in your chest and doesn't go away until something's finished. "How many?" I asked. "We don't know yet, but at least 4 complaints on record against Palmetto Estates for harassment and intimidation. 2 of the families settled out of court. Lowball sales, sudden code violations, unexplained police visits. Sound familiar?" I nodded. One woman filed a formal grievance after a deputy accidentally shut off her water meter during a routine property check. Another reported that her dog was poisoned a week after refusing an offer to sell. No charges ever filed. "And now?" I asked. Denise looked over at me for the first time since we'd left. Now they've messed with the wrong former prosecutor. And now we've got physical evidence, a verified forged court document, and a digital chain of custody that backs every step of it. I said nothing. I didn't need to, because now the dam was cracking, and once it did, it would flood everything. By the time we reached the federal building in Charleston, the Bureau had already subpoenaed Cheryl's phone records and seized the HOA's server. Denise's team pulled me into a private interview room. Bright lights, no windows, standard procedure. They had a transcriptionist, 2 special agents, and a tech expert in the corner verifying files from the backup drive. I spent 3 hours walking them through every incident, the offers to buy my land, the letters, the harassment, the false noise complaints, the police visits. I gave them names, dates, badge numbers, copies of emails. I handed over logs from my home network, every device that had connected, every login attempt, every spike in traffic when a file was being accessed or deleted. The tech guy whistled once when I showed him the layered backup system I'd designed. "You built this yourself?" he asked. I nodded. He glanced at Denise and said, "This is airtight, time-stamped, tamper-logged, AES encryption with an off-site checksum server. I've seen banks with looser protocols." Denise smirked. "Told you." "He's paranoid, but it works." I didn't bother correcting her. Paranoid was what they called you before they realized you were right. Back in Beaufort County, things were moving fast. Roy was pulled into an internal affairs interview that same afternoon. According to one of Denise's contacts, he'd started yelling before they even asked the first question, claimed it was just a misunderstanding, that he was following proper procedure, that the documents were verified by HOA legal counsel. Problem was, there was no HOA legal counsel. The Palmetto Estates Board had been operating without formal representation for over a year. Their last retained attorney had dropped them quietly after a zoning dispute with a neighboring parcel. That meant the documents were never reviewed, never filed, never submitted through any official channel, just created, printed, stamped with a forged seal, and handed to Roy like a loaded gun. And he'd fired it. Worse still, when they analyzed Cheryl's desktop computer, retrieved from the HOA's community office, they found a document editing tool still open, the demolition order. Metadata showed it had been created at 11:42 p.m. the night before my arrest, on her machine, under her login, and in the temp folder. An early draft with placeholder text, "Insert judge's name here." If that wasn't a smoking gun, I didn't know what was. But the real kicker came from a folder on her desktop labeled Expansion. Inside were PDFs of architectural plans, emailed estimates from construction companies, a proposal letter from a development firm called Carver Ridge Properties, offering to pay $3 million for the combined parcels of my land, and the lots directly adjacent, contingent on the successful completion of Phase 2 expansion. And, stapled to one of those emails, a handwritten note. "Marshall Green is the last obstacle. Roy says he'll handle it." Denise brought it to me personally, slid it across the table like she was dealing a royal flush. "I assume you recognize the handwriting," she said. I looked down at it. Elegant cursive, black ink, every loop smug. "Yeah," I said. "That's Cheryl." Later that evening, the arrest warrants were approved. Roy Baxter was taken into federal custody first, escorted out of the sheriff's office in handcuffs by 2 marshals, while half the department stared in stunned silence. Reports said he didn't speak, just looked at the floor. They booked him for unlawful imprisonment, falsifying legal documents, abuse of power, conspiracy to defraud, and civil rights violations under color of law. He was also informed that his pension had been frozen, pending criminal conviction. Cheryl was next. She tried to stall, claimed illness, claimed she was out of town, even deleted her Facebook account in a panic. But the marshals were already at her front door, search warrant in hand. They found her in the kitchen, still in her robe, holding a glass of white wine at 5 in the evening, inside her home office. Blank court letterheads, identical to those used in the forged order. A rubber stamp mimicking Judge Mitchell's seal purchased online, receipts for cash payments to consultants totaling $8,000, and a journal entry dated 2 weeks earlier where she'd written, "It has to happen this month. No more delays. We get the land. We get the deal." Roy will make sure there's no resistance. She was booked on multiple federal counts: conspiracy, document forgery, mail and wire fraud, illegal attempts to seize private property, and the same civil rights charges Roy now faced. And still, she tried to smile in her mugshot. Denise texted it to me with the caption, "Still thinks she's HOA, President of Earth." I laughed harder than I had in days. The next morning, a local news crew showed up outside Palmetto Estates. Word had gotten out. Scandal in the South, they called it. Headlines ran across the local stations. HOA president and deputy brother arrested in land grab conspiracy. The real residents, the quiet ones, the cautious ones, started coming forward. Some spoke to journalists, others to lawyers. One woman said she sold her property 2 years ago after repeated citations for imaginary landscaping violations. Another said Roy threatened to have her son arrested if they didn't comply with HOA standards, even though their home, like mine, sat outside its jurisdiction. The scheme wasn't new. It had just been allowed for too long. But now it was exposed, and the storm was just beginning. It didn't take long after the arrests for everything to unravel completely. The House of Baxter, as the locals half-mockingly called it, wasn't built on strength. It was built on silence, fear, and paperwork that didn't hold up under real scrutiny. And once that silence was broken, everyone who had something to lose started looking for the fastest way out. 2 days after Cheryl and Roy were booked, the HOA board called an emergency meeting, this time under the supervision of a third-party legal oversight team dispatched by the county. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Denise sent me the minutes. Half the board claimed they'd had no knowledge of what Cheryl was doing. The treasurer resigned on the spot. The secretary brought in a binder of printed emails showing that Cheryl had ordered discreet campaigns against problematic property owners, coded language for anyone who refused to play ball. One of the board members had scribbled MG equals resistant, possible pressure needed on a post-it stuck to the inside of a folder. MG Marshall Green. It felt strange, reading my own initials like that. Like I was part of a case file instead of a person. I suppose that's how they'd seen me all along. Meanwhile, Roy Baxter wasn't doing well behind bars. Denise's contact inside the bureau said he'd already tried to position himself as a cooperative witness. He claimed Cheryl masterminded everything, that he just followed her lead, that he never meant to violate any rights. Unfortunately for Roy, the camera footage of him threatening me, handcuffing me, and dictating bogus charges while smiling like a man on top of the world didn't exactly support his new narrative. And then came the wild card, the workers. Two of the demolition contractors, Jose Ramirez and Tyler Boone, cut deals almost immediately. Their attorney arranged a deposition with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. They laid out the whole thing, how they were paid under the table, told to damage but not destroy, how Cheryl personally handed them photos of my property with red circles around the fence, the panels, the mailbox. One of them brought his phone. He still had the original message from Cheryl. Make it look like it's just prep work. Panels can go. That'll shake him. $2,000 each. No paperwork. No names. That phone ended up as Exhibit A in the conspiracy charge. But the most damning evidence came from a place none of us expected. Cheryl's home desktop had been a treasure trove of arrogance, but her tablet seized during the search was pure gold. There, in her private note-taking app, was an entire section titled Phase 2 Strategy, dozens of notes, screenshots, and recordings, including voice memos where she discussed dealing with Green, a saved draft of a letter she planned to send to the county, falsely alleging I had militia ties, a selfie she took in front of the development site with the caption, "Soon, ours," and, most incriminating of all, a scanned letter of intent from the developer promising full payout once the final parcel has been vacated or otherwise cleared. The phrase, "otherwise cleared," became an instant courtroom meme in the federal attorney offices. Denise told me later she laughed so hard she had to mute herself on the call with the assistant U.S. attorney. By the end of the week, the indictments were finalized. Roy Baxter was formally charged under federal law with deprivation of rights under color of law, falsification of public documents, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, abuse of official capacity. He pled guilty to 3 counts as part of a plea deal, no trial, 8 years in federal prison, forfeiture of pension, lifetime bar from any public office or law enforcement role. His plea included full cooperation in the investigation of Cheryl and other associates. Cheryl Baxter tried to hold out longer. She lawyered up fast, denied everything, claimed she was manipulated by her brother. But the paper trail didn't lie, and neither did her own tablet. She was charged with conspiracy to commit wire and mail fraud, forgery of court documents, attempted illegal seizure of property, witness tampering, civil rights violations. Her trial lasted 5 days. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict, sentence 6 years in federal prison, immediate asset freeze. Her accounts, her vacation property in Hilton Head, even her late husband's pension fund, all tied up in restitution. During sentencing, she tried to speak. The judge cut her off and said, "Mrs. Baxter, you abused the structure of local governance to harass, intimidate, and illegally attempt to seize land that did not belong to you. You used your position to destroy lives for profit. That ends now." He banged the gavel, and just like that, the empire was officially dead. But the fallout didn't stop there. The county sheriff's department launched an internal audit. Turned out, Roy wasn't acting alone. The chief of police, a man named Dean Morrissey, had signed off on 3 of Roy's false reports in the last 5 years, claimed he trusted his men. That trust cost him 3 years in federal prison for criminal negligence in aiding unlawful actions. And the HOA, put into immediate federal oversight. A forensic audit revealed $89,000 unaccounted for in discretionary spending. HOA dues had been misused for everything from security upgrades to personal travel for board members. Residents voted to dissolve the HOA entirely and petitioned the county for direct administrative support. They got it. I received a check from the Federal Victims Fund 6 weeks later, $340,000 in damages, plus an additional $70,000 for property repair. More importantly, I received dozens of messages from people I'd never spoken to. A woman with 2 kids who said she'd lived in fear for years. A retired teacher who thanked me for doing what no one else could. Even one of the former board members, anonymously, who sent me a note that read, "We were cowards. You weren't. Thank you." I kept that one because I didn't win anything. I just made sure they lost. And sometimes, in the real world, that's what justice looks like. A year later, the house looked just like it had before the storm, except quieter. The solar panels were new, sleeker, mounted tighter against the roofline like a quiet badge of resilience. The mailbox was made of solid steel now, custom built. The fence had been rebuilt higher with treated oak slats and reinforced posts. But none of those were the real additions. The real change sat in the far corner of the front yard, just inside the property line where the contractor crew had torn the gate down. That space used to be a patch of weeds and gravel. Now it was a carefully designed dry rock garden, pale river stones, a single Japanese maple in the center, and a square granite slab mounted on a base. Etched into the stone were simple words, "Here lies the end of the Baxter Empire, 2024. People stopped to look at it sometimes. Cars slowed down. A few walkers would pause on their route and take a picture or just stand there in silence. The HOA was gone. Palmetto Estates restructured under a temporary community advisory group run by the residents themselves. No dues, no board, just neighbors figuring out how to live together again. It hadn't been easy. There were lawsuits, some still ongoing. The 4 families who'd been previously pressured into selling had their own class action filed. One of them got their property back entirely through a settlement. Another was awarded double what they'd sold for. And Cheryl's assets? Liquidated. Her beach condo sold at auction. The Tesla she used to flaunt at board meetings? Gone. Her name wasn't spoken much in the community anymore. No one visited her in prison. Not even Roy, who ended up being transferred to a low-security facility in Arkansas. From what I heard, he'd taken up painting. Still claimed he was just following orders. They always do, until the orders stop working. That afternoon, Denise pulled into my driveway for the first time in months. She was off duty, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, and carried a bottle of bourbon under one arm like a peace offering. I was on the porch with my feet up and a book open that I hadn't touched in over an hour. "You're impossible to surprise," she said as she climbed the steps. "I installed a perimeter alert. You tripped it 20 seconds ago." She smirked and sat down beside me. "You look calmer," she said. "I am." We drank in silence for a while. The wind rustled through the trees behind the house. Insects buzzed lazily near the railing. Finally, she said, "You never really told me why. Why not stop it early? Why let yourself get arrested?" I looked out across the yard to the stone slab. Because if I stopped them early, they would have just tried again. Roy would have had the documents rewritten properly. Cheryl would have cleaned the metadata. They'd have played it smarter next time. But this way, they went all in. Gave me everything. I took a sip of bourbon, let it sit a second. People like that don't quit when they get scared. They quit when they get caught. She nodded slowly. "You could have gotten hurt." I shrugged. "I had insurance, and I knew you'd answer." She laughed once. "You really are a bastard. You say that like it's news." The sun dipped lower. The shadows stretched long across the grass. A neighbor I didn't know waved from the sidewalk. I raised a hand back, just enough. Before Denise left, she walked down to the stone garden. She stood in front of it for a full minute, then took a picture with her phone. "You gonna post that?" I asked. She smiled. "No. Just wanted a reminder." She paused, then said something I didn't expect. "You know, Marshall, most people don't win. Not against systems like this. Not against people who know how to bend the rules." "I didn't win," I said. "I just let them lose." She stared at me for a moment, then got in her car and drove away. I sat there a while longer, bourbon in hand, watching the last sliver of sun melt behind the trees. Tomorrow, I'd work on the back fence. Maybe replant the hydrangeas, maybe not. There was time now.